Welcome, everyone. Now, before we get started this evening, I just wanted to offer a word of thanks to all of our membership. Your support of the Minnesota Archaeological Society allows us to continue hosting events like this. And we're excited to be able to share these presentations with our membership and also to reach a larger audience through our online lectures. At this time, I am excited to introduce Dr. Ron Schirmer, who is going to talk about preservation and initial studies at the Belle Creek site complex. Over the last 6 years, Ron has been part of a now successful effort to purchase, preserve, and begin studying the Belle Creek site complex. In this presentation, he will talk about the process, discuss the place of the site in a regional perspective, and share the first research results as well as plans for upcoming fieldwork. So at this time, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Schirmer. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Mandy. I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm always happy to share, I don't know, a few tidbits of what I know and what I've been doing over the last 20 some years. You'll have to forgive me if I get a little bit deep into the weeds on some things, but I feel it's important to provide a lot of information. If I'm going to give people information, boy, I'm gonna give you information. So thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Back in 2017, in late season, about November, I got a phone call from a good friend of mine, Shelley Buck, who was then the president of the Prairie Island Indian Community Tribal Council. And she let me know that she had been contacted to provide some information about possible sale of a large parcel of land in the Red Wing area. That was known to contain some pretty significant archaeological resources. And so Shelley called me to say, hey, Ron, should we buy this? And I thought, well, I'll take a look and see what's really there. And so I looked at the parcel numbers, and it's not an exaggeration to say I kind of freaked out a little bit. And I probably shouldn't have, but I did kind of freak out because I was like, holy cow. So I immediately called Shelley back, and I'm like, yeah. And she said, well, we're meeting on Monday to discuss this. Can you write something up over the weekend to, provide something of a rationale for why we should buy it and what we would actually do with it? And I said, well, sure. And so I had a very eventful weekend. The interesting thing is that, of course, the parcels that they were interested in purchasing included parts or all of 21 GD 65, 66, 67, 68, 70, 72, and 200. And what that means is that there's a lot of archaeology that was in these parcels. And immediately I'm like, holy Moses, that's some important stuff. And I will note, before I go on to the next slide, I'll note that in our process of researching some of this, we've discovered that there are some problems with some of the initial data that we are using. For example, as we've worked on all of this, we've found that the site polygons for GD 65 and GD 70 are in the wrong places. We've done a lot of research on the original Lewis mappings and all of that, and found that those polygons are in the wrong places. So we're going to be filing some site update forms to correct those problems. And we've also noted that the site polygons for GD 68, which I think if you can see my cursor, hopefully GD 68 is here and GD 70 is here. I'm sorry, GD 200 rather is here. And you can see that GD 68 is a single mound, and really the polygon shouldn't look like that. And GD 200 is a village, and it doesn't exist on the other side of the river. So there are some issues with these polygons, but we'll be working on that. I should also let you know that in the LiDAR, there are additional unmapped archaeological resources in these parcels consisting of a number of mounds in these areas through in here that, again, have not yet been recorded. So we'll be preparing site forms for those in the near future. So you might be wondering, well, okay, great. So it's a site. or a couple of sites with some mounds there. What's the real big deal about this? Why were you losing your stuff, Ron? Well, I have to get a little bit into some of the Red Wing background information to properly contextualize why this is such a significant site and why it's such a significant success at preservation and proper stewardship of the archaeological past. So this is kind of our standby slide where we present the kind of the Red Wing region itself as a setting for archaeological resources. And you'll note that there's this big, nice yellow outline here. And I'm very fond of joking that no, it's not actually a Protoceratops outline, although I'm very happy that that's what it does end up looking like. This is just kind of how we've mapped out what we think the relevant sites are in the region. Now, we should note that the boundaries here are not especially real. Okay, these are just where we've kind of looked at the records and we think that this is the boundary of where some of the relevant sites are. There's been, a fair amount of work, which I'll talk about a little bit more in just a little bit, in the area. But, there are other sites extending up outside of the region as we've drawn it that, perhaps some of those should actually be included. There's not enough information right now to know that they should be included. So that's gonna need a little bit more work. What should be apparent from this is that it's really a huge, huge collection of sites, right? There's dozens and dozens of habitation sites. And in this small area, there were thousands of mapped burial mounds, right? So what this means is, and most of them are smallish burial mounds that are probably late pre-contact. Most of the habitation sites are late pre-contact. What that means is that there's a really, really intense late pre-contact habitation occupation throughout this whole area. And we say that knowing that there's actually a lot more there than we even know of. Comparatively little survey has gone on in the Red Wing area, given its size and given its importance. And I know that, anytime we're out doing any kind of survey, we're always finding more sites. So there's not, this is not by any means a closed boundary. It's not by any means a finite number of sites in the area. There's a lot going on. Now, I shouldn't let you think for very long that any of us have done really great stuff. People have known about Red Wing archaeology, and I think this is probably one of the only places, if not the only place in the state, where people have known about Red Wing archaeology for better than 200 years already. Archaeological resources in the Red Wing area were first documented or first mentioned, so far as I can tell, as early as 1817 in the Stephen H. Long expedition notes. And they're mentioned again in more detail in the 1823 notes, where they talk about mounds exceeding in abundance any that the party had ever seen before. Now you might wonder, okay, why is that significant? Well, it's significant because in the 1823 expedition, they had started in St. Louis, home, of course, to Cahokia and the massive center of mounds all down there. And they got to Red Wing and they're like, wait, there's more here than down there. So it's a pretty significant area, and they knew it right from the start. From the 1850s to the 1930s, there's not much that really goes on. There's some amateurs working, and some of them are pretty responsible. Some of them were definitely not very responsible. But the real interesting story starts in the 1880s when T.H. Lewis came and started doing his big mound mapping project. And in the 1884 to 1886 period, he actually maps more than 1,500 mounds in the Red Wing area. And he notes in his mapping that there's at least an additional 500 that he didn't map, but that he knew were there. And since that, more than an additional 100 mounds have been found. So we're continuing to find more and more and more. So it's really a big area. Interestingly, all of that early work is really referencing the mounds, not the habitation sites. If you look on the chart here, this is Brouwer's famous chart of the Red Wing region. You can see that there are some little circles here, and there's a little circle here, and there's a couple circles here, and this is Belle Creek. So there's a couple circles here. So they knew there was 2 villages there already by 1903. And there's another circle down in here, Canada Junction, another circle over here. So they knew about the big villages, but they really didn't do anything there. They were just kind of interested in the mounds at the time. So Red Wing archaeology proper doesn't start until the late 1940s, right? Good old Lloyd Wilford, who else, started Red Wing excavations in 1947. He started that at the Silvernail site. And in 1948, he went out, and in 1947 at Silvernail is when he found the first Middle Mississippian pottery, which was what he thought it was at the time. And this upper sherd here is one of those sherds that he found in 1947 that led him to think that there's a Middle Mississippian component there. In 1948, he went out to the Bartron village, did the first excavations there. That's where he found this bugger right here. And that's when he said, oh, look, there's Oneota here too. And then he went back in 1950 to Silvernail, and then he found Oneota materials at Silvernail. And then in 1951 to 1957, he's working out at the Bryan site, and he's finding Silvernail and Oneota, and he's finding all kinds of stuff. So this led in the mid-1950s to the kind of the first published article talking about what's kind of going on in the Red Wing scene, where he's like, okay, I've found this stuff, and I don't think it's really Middle Mississippian anymore. I'm going to call it Upper Mississippian because it does have some differences. But, I don't really know specifically what's going on. And what he said at the time was he thinks that there's an evolutionary path going on where there's a transition from late woodland where Middle Mississippian gets added to it, and that yields the Silvernail stuff, and that ends up becoming Oneota. And that's remained one of the primary narratives until modern times when we've actually been kind of upending some of that. But he also recognized that he really didn't know anything about late woodland, and so his reconstruction, he admitted, was kind of tentative. Well, that takes us really kind of to the 1960s to the 1990s when the volume of data just exploded. It starts in the late 1960s with Eldon Johnson doing his work out at the Bartron site. And then it continues in the 1980, 1981 when he's working at the cooling tower site right next to Bartron. In the 1979 work that Guy Gibbon prepared, where he actually wrote up all of that previous work that Lloyd Wilford had done and that Eldon Johnson had written up but never actually published, Guy put together all of this information to start building this picture about what Red Wing is, what a big deal it is, where all this stuff is, and started kind of coming at this question about what's really going on. Now, what's interesting about that is that Guy had he had come from the University of Wisconsin, actually from the University of Illinois system, studying archaeology, Oneota archaeology in Wisconsin. So when he got to the University of Minnesota, he knew what Oneota was, at least in eastern Wisconsin. And he got to Minnesota and he's like, oh, well, this is actually different. And that other stuff that is all over Red Wing, that Silvernail stuff, that is really different. But he did say already in 1979, well, Red Wing is not Middle Mississippi, right? So that's out. But he said there are Middle Mississippian elements. And he said that does have something to do with the origins of Oneota, but he wasn't entirely sure what that really meant. Well, very quickly after that is when Clark Dobbs started excavations at the Bryan site, doing that massive dig from 83 to 84 while he was writing his doctoral dissertation. I can't imagine how he actually managed all of that. And then after that, Dobbs expanded his research to include the Adams site and the Burnside School site and the Energy Park site, the Merrow site, and the Cell site for the next 10 years. What he was able to document through doing all of that is that Oneota was much more variable than previously thought, but there's a lot more different stuff going on, and he wasn't really quite sure what to make of it because it's kind of scattered and a little bit difficult to integrate. So the data situation as of the late 1990s, when I started doing research there, was that there was a fair amount of work in Red Wing. Almost all of it was from the large complex villages with associated mound groups. So you can see there's Double, and there's Marrow, and there's Adams, and there's Silvernail, and Energy Park, and Bryan. Those are all, big villages with a whole bunch of encircling mounds. And that's where people had really focused almost all of their effort. That little tiny thing in the middle there, that's Bartron, and Cooling Tower is right over next to it. And so those are the other sites that had some data, but almost everything was from these studies in these big villages. Even then, however, the maximum amount of excavation that was ever done at the Bryan site was 12.5% of the site area. That means that basically the remainder of it was destroyed with almost no study, right? And even today, even after all of the years that I've been working in Red Wing, we still have, for any of these other villages, no more than like 1.5% of the site area that we've done any work on at all. In some cases, like Silvernail, we haven't even reached 1% of the site area that we've studied. So the data that we have are really comparatively limited. That said, they're pretty good, and we can say quite a lot about it. There's one, so most of the data is from a series of excavations at these big villages. There was one broad survey that Dobbs did for the city of Red Wing to kind of map out where sites were across this whole space. And growing out of all of this, we see the emergence of two competing ideas to try to explain what's going on in Red Wing. One of them is kind of this older idea that kind of was first put forward by Wilford and then kind of championed by Jim Stoltman and a few people like that, that the Middle Mississippian culture is present, that people who are actually Middle Mississippians are present in Red Wing, and that their interactions with late woodland folks is what yields this cultural blend that ends up becoming Oneota. So there's, in this model, there's people locally who are actually practicing a Middle Mississippian lifeway, and that they are affiliated with the Cahokia system downriver. And there's talk about, building prestige and all of that kind of deal. Okay, there's another version, and that's that the local late woodland folks were somehow influenced by Middle Mississippians. And that's the source of Oneota, but that there's not actually Middle Mississippi folks present. They're not actually doing Middle Mississippi lifeway. But that said, it remains unclear in that model why things are going on this way. In all of these models, nobody really says anything about the mechanisms of how all of this is going and all of that. So it's really still, as of the late 1990s, kind of uncertain. So that's where kind of I enter the picture, and my dear friend Ed Fleming enters the picture, because we wrote the first two full-scale doctoral dissertations on what's going on in Red Wing, and started really reshaping the landscape of what we understand Red Wing archaeology to be. So I was looking at plant remains from the Bryan site, and one of the things that I was able to document is that in different areas of the site that were occupied at the same time, there were different plant use systems that people were engaging in. I also was able to note that, they were building different kinds of houses, they were making and using different kinds of pottery, and nevertheless that they're still at a single site and that they are sharing some aspects of culture. So what that means to me, or what that meant to me, was that these are polycultural villages, that there's multiple groups of people living at these villages at the same time, which is a pretty interesting kind of thing. That's not a typical idea that we end up seeing a lot in most archaeological analyses. We tend to think about sites as being a product of one group living in one place. Well, in this case, it's clear that's not what's going on. And that's part of what is leading to all of this interesting complication. The other thing that I was able to document is that there was a particular social process going on fairly frequently, actually, in the Bryan site. And that's this process called feasting. And what we mean by feasting is that periodically people would mobilize large quantities of food, large varieties of food, lots of plants, lots of animals. They'd, use, big pieces of pottery. They'd actually, get out all kinds of different lithic raw materials and exchange them and all of this kind of stuff. So what I was able to document is that in the overall refuse deposition pattern, there was a very, very intense degree of generation of refuse. And I measured that by grams per liter concentration of carbonized plant remains, and it was at least 3 times greater than even the greatest concentrations at Cahokia. So there's a lot going on here. And indeed, there were at least 12 distinct events where I was able to document feasting going on in the record. So we know that these are polycultural villages. We know that feasting is a big thing going on. And then Ed picked up with doing his study of the Merrow pottery, and he was able to document that, yeah, there's actually multiple different kinds of pottery that people are making and using at the same time, and that confirms that there's polyculturalism going on, that rolled rim and flared rim pottery, being Mississippian-like and Oneota-like pottery, those are being made and used at the same time. And eventually rolled rim just kind of goes away. But then he also added that there's this other concept that becomes really important, and that's the concept of aggregation, such that what he was able to document is that, yeah, there's actually people from across a very, very wide region who are all coming in to Red Wing, and that actually kind of complements what I was able to document with these being polycultural and feasting. So aggregation across the region is one of these key things that's going on there. So what does all of this kind of lead to? This leads to some really, really important developments that set that back stage for trying to figure out, what does Belle Creek mean? Why am I talking about all this? This is all this background to understanding what Belle Creek is about, or at least what the relevant questions are. So what comes out of this work that we were doing in the 2000s is that there's actually no evidence of actual Middle Mississippian practices. There's very, very little evidence of, Middle Mississippian related stuff compared to what all else is going on. We don't have any wall trenches. We don't have any plazas. We don't have any houses. We don't have, we have one palisade there, and it's not a typical Mississippian palisade. There's one small platform mound, but it's not in the same kind of place where Mississippians would have put it. So there's really not much that is really Middle Mississippian there. There is a small amount of non-local sort of Mississippian stuff. These are kind of widespread. There's like 1 or 2 things at each site. So there's a couple of copper mace pendants and one long-nosed god masquet, which are, properly speaking, not really Middle Mississippian. They're kind of Mississippian more generally. And there's a very narrow range of Middle Mississippians like pottery traits, and they are all adulterated. Right, so when we see rolled rims, which is typically thought of as Middle Mississippian, they're highly variable in terms of their execution. The decorations that we see on them are highly variable. None of these things are true to Mississippian pottery standards. We know that there's none of the rest of the Middle Mississippian pottery assemblages there. There's no bottles, there's no seed jars, there's no plates, there's no ladles, there's nothing like that. Right? We also know that currently we don't have a single genuine Middle Mississippian shirt that we've identified. There are a couple of red slip shirts, but they haven't been studied. We don't know where they're from. So it's really a pretty narrow range of stuff that ends up being, kind of Mississippian related. And as we look at it, there's quite a bit of plains related material there, right? So that in terms of pottery, there's Mill Creek and Anderson and other initial Middle Missouri stuff. There's Cambria pottery all over the place. And these are things that are real imports. They're not local things, like all that Mississippian-like pottery, that's all local stuff. All of this other stuff that's plains-like, that's imported stuff. So this obviously confirms what Fleming was talking about and saying that there's actually regional aggregation going on. People are coming from very, very long distances away, as far as like eastern South Dakota and northwestern Iowa. They're all coming there. We also see multi-notched points, which again are not Middle Mississippian inspired. They're not Cahokia points, they're Herald points. The bone toolage assemblage, is all plains-like. It's scapula, hose, and antler rakes and hide greeners and stuff like that. So there's a lot of plain stuff. So the ideas that we start coming out of this is that this isn't really what people thought it was. So what is Middle Mississippian? It's clearly, or I'm sorry, what is Silvernail? It's clearly not Middle Mississippian. What's going on other than Silvernail? What's going on with the late woodland? And up until this time, people really haven't focused on Oneota itself. They've mostly focused on what's going on in these big villages that have a lot of Silvernail stuff. So there's a third point that really frustrated me in all of this, and that's this idea that people had put in the literature that Red Wing was abandoned after the Silvernail. Well, what do we have to say about all of this? When we look at what's going on in the late woodlands, there's all kinds of stuff going on that leads to what happens in the Silvernail phase, and that leads to what becomes Oneota. First, we see that late woodlands populations start to trail out of the tributary valleys and into bigger locations in the central part of the valley on larger landforms. So we see population movement and concentration coming into the main part of the valley. We also see a shift in the preferences for where people are building mounds. Instead of primarily building mounds on high isolated spots, they start building them right on that same terrace right next to their villages. A couple of sites in Red Wing, notably the Mosquito Terrace Village and the Cooling Tower Village, we see that those sites actually have 5 to 10 different kinds of late woodland pottery, all of which date to the same time. So it looks like there's actually aggregation going on in late woodland times before all of this other later stuff. We should also note that when we get large enough pieces of late woodland pottery, these pots have constricted necks with high outflaring rims. We actually see decorative elements like these punctates and incised diagonal lines, stuff like that, that are all on the late woodland pottery. And that's all stuff that kind of carries into the Oneota tradition. So we can see that what's, kind of going on with a lot of this late woodland stuff is that it's evolving, it's changing before we see any of this other stuff going on. One other aspect that should be present there, but that we haven't documented yet, is subsistence change. We know at this time, across other parts of Minnesota, south central Minnesota, way up into northern Minnesota, even around Lake Mille Lacs, we know that people at this time, by 1100 AD, are already growing maize and quinopods and squashes and gourds and sunflowers, and they're growing all of these crops. These are food producing peoples, and I'm certain that they're intensifying this in late woodland times in Red Wing as well. We just don't have the data yet. We've got to get out and do more work. Now, how does this relate to what's going on, and what does this mean for understanding Silvernail? Well, what we see is that every single site that has Silvernail materials also has late woodland, Oneota, and Plains Village materials. Sometimes those are in different parts of the site. Sometimes they're actually mixed together in single deposits. So what we see is that the Silvernail stuff is actually only present in a few key sites. It's not widely distributed. In contrast, most of the late sites in Red Wing are actually late woodland or Oneota, and there's no evidence of Silvernail materials there. That's what really the local thing is going on. That's what people are doing most of the time. So what do we see Silvernail being? Silvernail phase is kind of a repurposing of a very limited range of Middle Mississippian attributes, actually just the pottery. And it's an adjunct to aggregation. Right? So what they did was they actually took these Ramey-esque styles that, as kind of a lingua franca, right? That a lot of people across the whole region understood because they'd seen it before. They knew that these big communities down south, and all these big communities down south are all reaching around and all that. So we see that kind of what's going on is they're taking this and they're making something different of it as part of this process of aggregating in these big villages. In anthropology more broadly, this is known as a situational identity. It's not uncommon. It shouldn't surprise us to see this in the archaeological record, even though it is a little bit challenging to imagine. So what do we see going on then outside of Silvernail? What's going on with Oneota apart from? In the last, decade and a half, Ed and I have been working on acquiring a lot of dates, reanalyzing collections, doing some new excavations. And we've found that based on really new, really good dates on annuals, not big pieces of wood that give you bad dates, but little tiny things that grew in one year, And when we're very selective about where we're taking them, right? Take a single corn kernel that's associated with a big sherd in a pod or in a pit that only has one kind of pottery. What we see is that we can actually get much better dates on this stuff and get a much better picture of what's going on. So we've got more better dates on silver nail pottery, on link type pottery, and on cannon incised Oneota pottery. And this complements a suite of more than 90 other dates. And what we're able to say now is that silver nail, link, and Oneota or cannon incised, all of those kinds of pottery are all being made at the same time for at least a period of 80 years. People there were making all three kinds and using all three kinds at the same time. We know that after 1250, there's no more rolled rim stuff. None of the rolled rims date later than that. Link, the flared rim stuff with little rim tabs, that does date a little bit later. Not real long, but it hangs on for a while. But the Oneota stuff persists, and that starts, the Oneota stuff, that starts as early as 1150 as part of that outgrowth and that change process that late woodlanders are going through. So what we can see in terms of the summary is that these vessels on the left here, those are from the McClelland village. The vessels on the right are from the Bartron village. These are separate in time by a couple hundred years, and the style just really does not change for that whole time. So Oneota occupations on the big rivers, they all date from 1150 to 1300. We see those components at a number of sites. Oneota occupations at sites away from the big river, like at Burnside School in McClelland, and probably Sell. We don't have dates there yet, but the occupation history there is a little bit unclear, but that starts around 1300. So what goes on is that the big villages near the river, they get abandoned, but people move inland, and there's more Oneota stuff going on inland. So Oneota stuff fully overlaps the silver nail. Red Wing was not abandoned, and there's not a lot of change in that Oneota stuff once it emerges. So what we've done based on this is develop a new interpretive sequence. So we have the Bartron phase from 1150 to 1300, the Spring Creek phase from 1300 to 1400, where we can actually categorize things, and describe these in very different ways. So we know that these are, this is a local sequence. There's a change in the middle of it that helps us understand what's going on. And when we look at the plant remains, we see that's pretty consistent all the way through that. So this is a local group that emerges out of late woodland folks around 1150, maybe 1120, who knows. And then they start getting involved in all of that other Mississippian stuff that's going on. And that is what yields all of this really interesting complex stuff at the big villages. But what does all this mean about Belle Creek, right? So we have a really good sense of the interpretation of Red Wing for much of the area, but what's going on with Belle Creek? Where does that fit in? We don't know anything about it, right? The only thing that we know, a couple of small things, right? One is that a friend of mine was actually out canoeing in the 2015 on the Cannon River, and he found that upper sherd. He found that sherd there on a gravel bar about a mile below where we know Belle Creek is. But it's on a gravel bar in a river valley. Where is it actually from? Who knows, right? But all of this really that's why it blew my mind to think that we might be able to preserve and start studying Belle Creek, because the previous most extensive researcher there, Clark Dobbs, he was never able to get out there. They never gave him access to it. And for some of you, you probably remember my little grandmas from Red Wing, Jean Chesley and Elizabeth Hedin, even they were denied access to the land, right? And they were like really prominent people, and they were great, lovely people, but even they couldn't ever get out there. So I thought, holy Moses, what is going on? So after the properties acquired in 2019, we had some primary goals in doing some initial work out there. One was to just kind of understand the nature of the cultural deposits, kind of do a condition assessment. And remember that there's really no previous information. We know that, this guy, Schmidt, was out digging in the mounds in the 1930s. And I mean, it was really just looting, basically. We know that Eldon Johnson was supposedly out there in 1969. He put in a 1x1. But the artifacts are lost. There's no documentation. There's one note in a letter that he wrote to Liz Hedin saying, well, the pottery is much like that at the Bryan site. But there's like a dozen different kinds of pottery at the Bryan site. So what does that even mean? Right? It's just, a silly thing. So we really know nothing. So is it disturbed? Is it undisturbed? Has it been cultivated? All these basic questions. What's there and what kind of condition is it in? That's what one of the big things we want to find out. We also wanted to work with the Prairie Island Indian Community Tribal Historic Preservation Office to develop a site management plan. Because, they can't manage what they don't understand. So we wanted to work with them to help them understand what's going on at the site and kind of turn it into something that the community can use. So that this descendant population can go to an ancestral site and they can hang out with their ancestors, go and make, say their prayers, make offerings, commune with their own history that's, largely been stripped of them. So, make it into a resource that the community can actually use. And note at this time, and right after 2019, we didn't have access to the bulk of the habitation area, right? So really only to the mound area and a tiny little sliver of land just south of the mounds. But that also gave us something else interesting to do, is to start this process of trying to think about what's the nature of the space between what we know to be a burial area and what we suspect to be a habitation area. So those are some of those additional questions. And one of the additional things that we had in mind all along was that this information that we're going to generate from doing some high-end studies is information that we want to bring to bear on other problems of Minnesota archaeology, right? Advancing how we can actually practice archaeology as a research-based sort of thing. So here's the 2012 LIDAR from Belle Creek. Now remember, the 2012 LIDAR was just a watershed event for Minnesota archaeology. It gave us unprecedented levels of detail at all of these different sites, right? Understanding how well preserved they are, understanding how completely destroyed they are, just understanding them, where they are in the landscape, lots and lots of stuff. So in this image, you can see the mounds are pretty darn obvious, right? Look at all these bumps all over the place. You know what else is obvious? These pits, these looters pits all over in the tops of a bunch of these mounds. Some of these we can confidently identify. For example, in the 1938 work that Schmidt did out there, this is the mound right here. That's the one he was digging. He describes it very, very clearly, right? So we can also see that there's an area up here that's been flattened. You can see a little road here, but largely you can see a field edge push all along these edges. So, we know that there's a certain amount of disturbance and there should be mounds up here, but they're not really visible on the surface anymore. So that was then our first issue. First, we want to see about how can we actually understand, how can we study these mound locations? So we took a look at the original sketch map and the original location information from T.H. Lewis when he mapped in 1885. And we replotted the exact mound group as he mapped it. And so that then we could drop that onto the LIDAR and just see, okay, well, how accurate is Lewis? And what you can see in the right-hand picture here, the yellow stuff, that is the Lewis mound notes as directly prescribed and just applied without correction to the site. We keyed them on here on mound 8, because that's the first one in the mapping sequence that was clearly visible. So then we projected these ones backwards, and in the yellow, you can see we projected all these other ones forward. But what you can also tell is that in the LIDAR, you can see where the actual mound locations are. And what this tells us is that, yeah, there's actually there's an error. There's a series of errors in Lewis's work. So we can see that there's actually a linear error, a distance error that creeps worse and worse and worse the farther east you go. But we can also see, based on other data later on that I'll show you in the geophysics, that there are some angle errors. The distance error seems to be kind of regular. We can predict it now. Whether or not that applies the same way to other sites, we can't quite say, but this is at least a starting point. So you can't just use T.H. Lewis, but a lot of T.H. Lewis is pretty decent. So second, we wanted to actually do a bunch of geophysical survey to start exploring this flat area out in the field. Can we refine those mounds? What kind of methods are going to use, are going to work right? And we wanted to go with geophysics, non-invasive survey. So one, we wanted to relocate the mapped mounds that we can't see anymore. We also wanted to investigate the areas between the mounds. And that's something that's really been kind of really, I don't know, grating on me for quite a while, is that we tend to think about mound groups as a collection of separate things, rather than as an entirety of a sacred landscape. And I've always, I mean, if you think about how people use cemeteries today, right? There's all kinds of stuff there. There's a bunch of graves there, but then there's other stuff. There's little reflection benches. There's little ponds that you can sit at. There's little groves where you can go and, meditate or pray or do whatever. But those are just as much a part of the cemetery for us now. So why would it be that for ancient cemeteries, we don't really think so much about the area between the mounds? So I wanted to do some work to see what's going on between them, because I think there's important information there. And I wanted to make sure that we did this using multiple different methods so that we could see, is GPR, is ground penetrating radar working well? Is electrical resistance working well? Is magnetometry working well? What methods are going to work best? And moreover, use multiple methods so that we can bounce these data off each other and be pretty certain about what it is that we're seeing. So looking through the geophysical data, this is the southern part, the four southernmost 20 by 20 meter grids. And you can see in here, the resistance down there wasn't all that useful for some reason. The magnetometry does actually show where these mapped mounds are. And these are the ones that have been corrected to the hillshade. So these are the real locations, and the geophysics shows it. And of course, the ground penetrating radar, the signal couldn't be clearer. So yeah, boy, oh boy, can we ever say, yeah, we know that these are mounds. We know how the geophysics is going to work in these cases. So we went to the next area north. And here we can see there's a little bit of a soil texture change. South, it's a little bit sandier. We get into this area that gets a little bit siltier. And we can see that here, the resistance starts to show some of these things pretty well. But importantly, you can see these green ones out here, those green mound locations. Those are the ones that we projected into the field based on the corrected hillshade mapping from the other part of the area. But these are not visible on the surface. And now it looks like, actually the geophysics might be showing that there's been another kind of error somewhere else, an angle error or something like that. But the resistance shows them, the magnetometry shows them, and the ground penetrating radar shows them. So in these areas where we have surface expression versus no surface expression, yes, the geophysics is showing us perfectly well where these are. Going to the farthest north section, the units up at the top there, we can actually see, again, this is all in an area where there's no mounds visible. The resistance is showing us interesting things. These two things are very clearly mounds. There's something weird going on between them. And there's another kind of weird thing going on over here. Don't quite know what that is. We obviously aren't going to test it. So, burial related. And then we think that this mound is probably drawn in the wrong direction. So if you angle these ones down to where they probably should be, the angle of this one changes. So this part right here might actually be part of that mound, and it would actually extend across like that. Magnetometry shows similar things. Here we have these mounds here. The ground penetrating radar shows the same things. And they also show, very interestingly, something weird between the mounds. It's a little bit unclear in the res, but it's a little clearer in the mag, and it actually looks like a series of mag highs complemented by a series of mag lows in the form of a spiral. You can see it as well showing up in the ground penetrating radar. And this is, again, one of these interesting things. It's not visible on the surface. This is not the kind of thing that one would otherwise expect in a mound group. It wasn't mapped by T.H. Lewis. But importantly, this isn't the only one that we've heard of. Years ago, Ed Fleming and I were working on, I think, the Renelius site. And there was, Jensen, I think, had said that there was a spiral at the Renelius site. We went out there and we couldn't actually find it. But at least there's this reference that there was one. So it looks like, yeah, the area between the mounds, that has sacred stuff going on too. Okay, and you can see it in the geophysics, even if it's not on the surface. So then the third part of what we wanted to do is do some shovel testing. We put in a 5-meter grid. Originally, our 5-meter grid was just in this area right here, right south of those mounds. That's in 2020. In 21, we expanded it to the east and to the west to start investigating this area between the mounds and where we believe the village to be. As it turns out, at other sites like Silvernail and Bryan, the village extends all the way directly up to the edge of the mound group, and in some cases actually even into the mound group, such that at Silvernail, for example, there are mounds on top of house basins and such like that. So we know that there's complicated history there. I want to see, is there complicated history here? Well, based on this so far, there's only a light scatter of artifacts in this area south of the mounds. And I think that that's probably a good indicator of, not as dense or long-term an occupation here. Again, preliminary, still trying to figure that out. But we also noticed that the artifact assemblage from shovel tests over in the south part of the area seems to be different from the artifact assemblage in the east part of the area. That might indicate that there is some horizontal separation between different occupations at the site. Again, preliminary, got to keep working at it. Now, in 2020, something else really quite monumental happened, and that was that in 2020, 2 different counties were selected for advanced LiDAR mapping at kind of an impossibly high resolution. They just flew it at an experimentally high level to just see what are the limits of what we can do with the LiDAR mapping. Thankfully, Goodhue County was one of the counties that they did. And because we at Mankato work so much with the LiDAR and archaeology, they sent us an advanced copy to say, hey, can you look at this for us and let us know what you think? So my data guru and right-hand man, Andy Brown, plotted everything up, and he showed it to me and said, what's going on with these? And I looked and I'm like, what? So if you look in the image here, you can just like at this pockmarked surface, just all these, like, it's like a lunar landscape, all these craters everywhere. And so we went out and looked at it. We're like, what the hell? And pardon the vulgarity, but I want to be authentic. That's what the hell? In reality, on the ground, most of these things are about 70 centimeters across and 10 to 15 centimeters deep. In all of the old LiDAR, you would never see them. In this, boy, oh boy, are they ever there. But then I was like, well, what the hell are they? Right? I mean, so I sent my buddy Randy Schetzel a note. He's a lust god, just a soil guru. And I said, Randy, what do you make of this? And he replied and said, well, gosh, Ron, how interesting that you email right now, because just last week, Mike Hombacher, right, that is Randy talking, wrote an article about these things. And there they had identified the same process. They had identified these little craters in high resolution LiDAR. They went and tested them and found that they were abandoned or emptied cache pits. So in this new LiDAR, you can even see the square shape of some of the pits in the tops of the mounds. So we can also recognize that there's some additional mounds in here in the village area, perhaps. Maybe they're refuse mounds, maybe they're burial mounds, don't know. We'll have to do geophysics and see. But we all of a sudden start to see, oh, there's something else here for us to look at. So we put in some excavation units to try to investigate some of these. What we found is that, yeah, number one, the artifacts from the excavation units does confirm that late woodland pottery and quartzite flakes are more present toward the east side of the site. Shell-tempered pottery and Prairie du Chien chert and Grand Meadow chert tend to be more present, at least so far, in the southern excavation units. We also did find what I believe to be a fragment of a Cambria rim. So there's maybe some interesting evidence of, aggregation going on there. And the excavation units confirmed that, yeah, these are emptied cache pits. They're almost impossible to see. You can see that very, very slight darkening in this here. And I'll tell you, if we had been coming down on them vertically, if we'd looked down on the top, you never would have seen it. And indeed, had this site ever actually been cultivated, like a couple times, the surface expression, you would have lost them. So because this is uncultivated and because we got that new LiDAR, now we're able to fill in this very, very interesting part of an archaeological story that we just simply don't see anywhere else. So cool. So then in the middle of when we're doing all of that, then, summer of 2020, when we're doing the shovel testing and doing the initial geophysics on the mountain and all that, council contacted me to say, hey, we've been contacted by the family that owns the parcel south, and they're wondering if we want to buy it. So they called me to say, well, what do you think? And I'm like, well, hell yeah. So there was a little bit of price tension back and forth. There's an unfortunate reality that people think that, because some native communities have casinos, that they're just, they have inevitable or just incredible amounts of wealth and they can just do anything with it. And, it's kind of a rude assumption. But anyway, there's a little attention, but tribe purchased it. So the remainder of GD72 and all of GD200 were purchased. And so now this is just a complete cultural landscape with all these late woodland mounds up on the top, these other mounds in a big arc surrounding a habitation site and a couple of big habitation sites. And you know something? You can stand there and look around and it's just like it would have looked 800 years ago, except perhaps a little bit more wooded. You can't look out and see the city. It's like if you were at the Energy Park site, which is also preserved, you look around, the city is everywhere. You really can't experience what it would have been like to be there when the site was occupied. Here, there you go. This is what an intact cultural landscape would look like, and it's all now preserved. So our results so far are pretty darn interesting. Really, really exciting stuff. Maps can be useful, but they can contain errors, right? There are ways that we can use really good methods now to try to investigate things like mound sites and understand them in a better way. And I think it's really important for us to do that because we have to remember that sacred sites deserve our best efforts at all times. And when we bring those best efforts, when we bring those high-end technologies to it, we can understand these sites in a much better way and improve how we manage them. Right? So we should use multiple non-invasive geophysical methods whenever we can, because they can help us find those quote unquote lost mounds, those leveled mounds that don't exist anymore. We shouldn't be like going and trying to do 15-meter interval testing to try to find mounds. No. Do the geophysics, right? This can also help us understand, what's in that empty space between the mounds. So current Wisconsin policy is as long as you're 5 feet away from the mapped edge of a mound, you're fine. You can do whatever you want. Right? In Minnesota, we have, ideally a 50-foot buffer, but, there's more than 50 feet between those two mounds where that little spiral is. And so we need to think about how we're actually managing and regulating these processes. But also we can say now the condition of the site is really excellent, right? Part of the northern area has some plow furrows you can see, but The rest of it, there's no plow zone evident. There are some really weird kind of rectilinear long shapes in the new LiDAR. We're not at all sure what those are yet. We'll hopefully start figuring some of that out. But mostly, partnerships are the best, right? Working directly with the Prairie Island community on all of this has been tremendously enriching, not only for me, but for them. I mean, and actually doing an informed and balanced and inclusive archaeology, it's a world of difference from how things used to be, and it's soul healing, right? A lot of archaeology has been done that wasn't very respectful, and now we can do better. So what are we going to do next? What are we doing this summer? May 16th to June 17th, we're going to go out back out. We have a new ultra receiver for our ground penetrating radar. I won't bother you with the details of that, but we're going to continue with the ultra receiver and go into the areas, do the geophysics here first in these units where the shovel tests are. And we want to do that because we want to see what do little tiny shovel tests look like in ground penetrating radar and all the other geophysical methods, because that tells us, what do historical disturbances look like? And this is a case where we know where they are and we know what they are, so we know how to interpret it. And then we're going to extend south, and we're going to extend as far south with the geophysics as we can into the habitation area so that we can identify some targets to do some selective excavation. It's just, to me, it's just not acceptable anymore to just go and plunk units down and say, wow, this looks like a good spot. No, do the non-invasive first. Figure out what you're going into and go into it with your eyes open, right? And finally, this summer, we want to, we've actually put in a legacy grant to acquire a drone-mounted thermal imaging camera so that we can try to apply here what people have been doing, like primarily down in like Iowa. Our friend Angela Collins down at the Iowa OSA has been doing a lot of work with thermal imaging, and boy, she thinks it would work great up here. So we want to, we have this grant application in, hopefully we get it, and we'll fly Belle Creek, and we'll fly Energy Park, and we'll fly Silvernail, so that we can actually continue expanding our understanding of how do we actually study these sites, what is there to find, and how can we generally just improve methodologies as well as just learn about this site. How does it fit into this picture? And how can we work with the Prairie Island community on interpreting it in the best way and making it the kind of resource that these descendant communities actually deserve? So I'll close there. That's kind of where we've been going and what I've been doing. And I guess I'll open it up for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ron. That was a fascinating presentation. We do have a few questions that are coming into the chat. So if you still have a question that's kind of percolating, make sure you drop that in the chat, send it to Minnesota Archaeological Society, and I'll be passing your questions on. So the first question I have is, could you just clarify what the Silvernail phase is a phase of?
Well, it's what an archaeological phase is just this period during which we can identify a group of people doing something particular, right? And so in this case, now, typically speaking, when we normally think of an archaeological phase, we think of it as the kind of the base way of life, the basic way of life, the fundamental way of life that these people are living at any particular time. But with the redefinition of what the Silvernail, what's going on with Silvernail, with that redefinition being that it's kind of it's a particular way that people were gathering at specific times and doing specific things. It's not a phase like other phase. It's what we call, again, a situational identity, right? Where a whole bunch of people got together and for purposes of interaction, adopted a specific way of doing things just during that time of interaction. So it's still, it's an archaeological phase, but it's a phase defined by episodic aggregation at central locations for purposes of social congress, basically. And hopefully that's clear. I don't know, I get kind of lost in my own words sometimes. So hopefully that helps explain it.
Thank you. Let's see. Another question is, what are sort of the go-to resources for like an overview of archaeology of this region? Is there like a couple of recommendations you have for like your go-to books or articles or sources?
So it is to my great shame that I have not yet finished the benchmark work. I've been working for, I don't know, 15 or 17 years on trying to finish the big book of Red Wing archaeology. And until it's finished, there really isn't a benchmark source. I have, there's an article, a book chapter that I published with Dale Henning that includes a kind of a nice little synopsis of some of our current thinking about Red Wing. That's in a book called, it's from the University of Florida Press, and it's called Cahokia Hegemony or something like that. You'd think I'd know the book title a little bit better since I have a chapter in it, but that's it's available on Amazon, I know, and it's from 2020 or 2021. I can't remember what. We finished writing the article in 2020, but it might have actually come out in 21. So there's that. I also did put an article in the Minnesota Archaeologist in the Gibbon Festschrift that talks a little bit about kind of our understanding of how his models have developed over time. But other than that, the only other previous work that's comprehensive is Gibbon's 1979 work, which is obviously really outdated. So I'm sorry that there's not a better answer. There is a forthcoming answer, but I don't know when I'll be able to finish the book. I'm working on it. I really am. I have a lot going on, and it's kind of tough to get to at times.
Fair enough. Thank you for that very honest answer. Okay, next question I have is about the cache pits. Wondering if there's any evidence of like wood or bark lining that you saw in the pits here.
That's a great question. So we did not see any evidence of any kind of a lining. When I was talking with Mike and Randy about this, one of the things they recommended was next time we dig one that we should take some pollen samples. Because one of the things that they thought was going on was that they were lining, that they had things that looked exactly like this, and they thought they were actually grass lined. And of course, a thin layer of grass really isn't going to leave much of a sign. So they may have been grass lined, but we don't have any evidence of bark lining or wood lining or anything. I will note that we do have evidence of some bark lined pits in Red Wing. One in particular, I think it was feature 10 in my excavations in block 2 at the Silvernail site, did have kind of a thick organic layer around the edge that is almost certainly evidence of bark line.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's really neat.
Oh yeah. Okay, a follow-up question to that. How deep are the cache pits at this site?
I think if the map, if I can scroll back here, that is roughly 70 centimeters, and this depression on the top is 75, 80 centimeters across, and the total depth of the depression is just under 10 centimeters. So they're the kind of a standard size of just short of a meter wide and just short of a meter deep.
That is all the questions I have right now that came into the chat. So just want to take the opportunity again to thank you for joining us this evening. This was a fantastic presentation. I know we learned a lot, and I'm sure there'll still be some other questions coming in at this time, but thank you so much for joining us this evening. This was really fantastic.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to have shared a little bit of knowledge, and hopefully some of it was interesting.
Absolutely, it was. Thank you.